Hi, I'm Rose from Mellow Yarns Crochet, and if you're new here, welcome to my channel. In this video, I'll be reviewing these anko yarns, which you can get at Kmart and Target stores across Australia and New Zealand. So keep watching to find out if these yarns are a bargain buy for your next crochet project, or if they're not worth the bother. In recent years, Kmart has really upped its craft game. They now stock a bunch of affordable entry-level craft materials for lots of different crafts, including candle making, resin crafts, scrapbooking, air-dry clay, and of course, knitting and crochet. The yarn selection is pretty limited, especially compared to other big box stores like Big W and Spotlight, but they have been expanding their range. They now have a 12-ply and an 8-ply acrylic, a fake fur yarn, a velvet yarn, a yarn cake, a super chunky yarn, and a multi-twist yarn. They don't stock any natural fibre yarns, but their yarns are very cheap, ranging from $2.50 a ball up to $6 Australian. So I thought I'd give some of them a go to find out if they could be a good option for new crocheters, or really any crocheters that are looking for more affordable yarns. They also have some crochet kits, which I've reviewed in another video, so make sure to check that out. But I will pause here to point out that they call their yarn selection knitting yarn. I'll try not to let the blatant anti-crochet bias cloud my judgment. Before we get stuck into the review, let me quickly introduce you to the 6S system that I use for reviewing yarns. I'll review each yarn in terms of its selection of colours. Are the colours nice? Does it have a good range of colours? Are there variegated, tonal, solid and semi-solid options? Softness. How does it feel to the touch? This is particularly important for wearables, but I think it matters even for projects that won't be used directly on your skin, because personally I hate crocheting with yarn that feels really rough. Springiness. Does the yarn have a bit of stretch and give? Stiff yarn isn't necessarily a problem. Cotton yarn, for example, tends to be quite stiff, and sometimes you actually want that for your final product so that it has some strength. But stiffer yarns can be a little harder to work with, especially if you're new to crochet. So it can be really useful to know if a yarn has a bit of give to it or not. Splittiness. Does the yarn have a tendency to split into its individual strands when you're crocheting with it? Splitty yarn can be super frustrating to work with and result in messy final products. Stitch definition. How defined do the final stitches look? A lack of stitch definition isn't always a problem. Fuzzy yarns, for example, tend to have really poor stitch definition but can look super lovely. But sometimes you just want that kind of clean, tidy look to your final stitches. And finally, dollars. Is it good value for money? I'll give each yarn a rating from 0 to 5 yarn balls for each criterion, as well as an overall rating out of 5. So the first yarn I'll review is this yarn cake. It's 100 grams, approximately 175 meters, 100% acrylic. The label doesn't actually provide a yarn weight, which is really not great. And it also doesn't provide a recommended crochet hook size. It has knitting needle size, but not crochet hook. So we'll need to kind of figure out ourselves what size crochet hook to use. This is the example pattern that they suggest you can make with this yarn. I mean, it's not the prettiest looking pattern. I'm not really sure what's going on in the collar region, but anyway, we'll keep an open mind. So I've calculated this at about 10 wraps per inch, which would make it a worsted weight yarn, or somewhere between a DK and a worsted weight yarn, which in Australian terms is somewhere between an 8-ply and a 10-ply. It does seem to be slightly thicker than the 8-ply yarn that I'll be reviewing later on in this video. So I think that feels about right. So given that, I will use my 5.5 millimeter crochet hook. This is a Clover Amour hook that I'll be using for this yarn review. So let's get stuck in. Okay, so our first criterion is selection of colours. This yarn cake comes in 2 colours, warm and cool. The warm is kind of different shades of brown. There's a little bit of a greeny colour in there. they're not the nicest looking colours, particularly in person. And then the second colourway is this one that I have here, which is the Cool, which is basically kind of shades of grey, a light lilac and a deeper purple colour. So look, it's not a great colour selection. There's only really those two options. I also think the pattern pictures are a little misleading. The colours look a lot more vibrant in the pictures than they do in real life, particularly this warm tone I found in person. The colours looked quite dull and muted, whereas they look fairly bright, especially this green colour in the example picture. So not great for colour selection. I will give it 1 yarn ball out of 5. Now for softness, it's actually not too bad. It is fairly soft. It's certainly not the softest acrylic that I've felt. It is a little bit scratchy on the fingers, but it's not too bad. And I think for a cheap yarn, it's probably about what I would expect. So I will give it 3 yarn balls out of 5 for softness. In terms of springiness, yeah, it's a very stiff yarn. There isn't really any stretch or give in the yarn. So this suggests that it may not be the best yarn for absolute beginners. I find new crocheters tend to have tension that is on the tighter side, and stiff yarns can be a little bit frustrating to work with when your tension is quite tight. It does, so the yarn is made up of individual strands and they do seem to separate fairly easily between my fingers, so I fear it might be a little bit splitty to work with, but I will reserve my judgment on that until we stitch it up. So yeah, let's make a swatch. So right off the bat, I'll say this yarn is not really the nicest to work with. It's quite grippy, it's not really flowing across my hook easily, and it feels quite rough on my fingers as I'm crocheting with it. I will say though, it's not splitting much, which is great. Okay, so here's my swatch of half double crochets. I will say this purple colour is quite nice. It's got little flecks of darker purple throughout it, although I'm not quite sure why there's so little of the light pink or lilac purple color. There seems to be a lot more of the other colors, so I'm not quite sure why they started with this small part of purple here. In terms of what it's like to crochet with, it doesn't feel great. It's very grippy. It kind of sticks to itself into the hook, and it feels like quite hard work to work with. In terms of stitch definition, it's not too bad actually. I think it looks nicer than I was expecting. It's got a little bit of fuzz to it, but it's still pretty good stitch definition for this kind of yarn. So in terms of stitch definition, I will give it 3 yarn balls out of 5. In terms of splittability, I didn't actually have any issues with it splitting, which surprised me, but that's great. So I'll give it a 4 out of 5 for splittability, only because I think it does have the potential to split, given it is made up of individual strands. And then the final criterion is value for money. It's obviously a very affordable yarn at just $4 a cake. However, you don't get very much in one cake. It's about 175 meters, whereas a lot of other yarn cakes you'll buy at places like Spotlight will have be significantly larger than that. So a good comparison point is the Lion Brand's Mandala Ombre. That is another kind of color changing cake yarn. That yarn is $14 for a cake, however it's significantly larger, so that works out at about 4 cents a meter. This yarn by comparison is about 2 cents a meter, so it is definitely a cheaper option, although Spotlight does quite regularly have 50% off sales, and I think if you were going to buy the Mandala Ombre at 50% off, it would be the same cost per meter, and I think is a much better quality yarn. Overall, I didn't love this yarn, and I probably wouldn't buy it again. It stitches up nicer than I was expecting, and I think, it would be fine to make up like a scarf, for example, but I just didn't enjoy working with it. And there are other yarns you can get at a really similar price point that are just so much nicer to work with. So overall, I'll give this yarn 2 yarn balls out of 5. Okay, so the next yarn I'll review is this super chunky yarn. It's 100 grams of 100% acrylic yarn and a super bulky weight. You get approximately 31 meters in a ball, which is not very much. This example pattern that they provide with the ball requires 8 balls of this yarn, for example, 4 in the grey and 4 in the lilac. So in terms of colour selection, this is the colour Sage. It also comes in a grey, an ecru, which is sort of a cream colour, and a lilac. So again, it's a pretty limited colour selection. They're all really kind of neutrals and pastels. So I will give it a 1 yarn ball out of 5 for colour selection. As for softness, it's actually really lovely. It feels really lovely to the touch. So I will give it a 4 out of 5 for softness. In terms of springiness, yeah, there's a little bit of give there. It's not the springiest yarn, but it's not quite as stiff as the yarn cake that I reviewed earlier. So I will give it 2 out of 5 for springiness. In terms of splittiness, it is made up of 3 individual strands, but let's see how it stitches up in terms of whether it has a tendency to split or not. The other thing I'd say is this does feel like it's quite loosely woven. So my suspicion would be that it's not the most durable of yarns. I suspect it might felt a little bit with wear over time, but I would just be speculating about that, having not made anything with this yarn or used it for any length of time. Yeah, so in terms of stitching up a swatch in this yarn, it is a super bulky weight yarn, which is a kind of 14 or 16 ply in Australian terms. So I will use a 10mm hook. So let's make up a swatch. So given this is a super bulky weight yarn, I'm going to use a 10 millimeter hook. Again, like with the other anko yarns, the yarn label doesn't actually recommend a crochet hook, only knitting needles. But I think given how bulky this weight is, I think really a 9 or a 10 millimeter hook would be the minimum needed. A little bit of yarn vomit there. Now I will say that actually already the yarn is looking quite messy just from being inside the inside of the ball. So yeah, it really does suggest to me that this probably isn't the most durable or hard wearing yarns, and it probably wouldn't hold up well to frequent washing and use. I think perhaps this needs a larger hook. This is the largest that I have, so we'll make do for now, but it is a little bit tight. I'm getting a little bit of splitting there. The individual yarn strands are quite loosely woven, and I think also just because this hook is maybe not quite large enough, it is splitting the strands a little bit, and I'm having to concentrate quite hard to avoid splitting the individual strands. To be fair to this yarn, I'm using a plastic hook here rather than the clover, which I do find not quite as easy to work with, but you can't, most hooks, in the larger sizes tend to come in plastic only. So here's my finished swatch. In terms of softness while I was crocheting, it does feel really nice still. It feels nice on the hands to crochet with. Splitability was terrible. It split a lot while I was crocheting with it. These strands are very loose. So I will give it 1 yarn ball out of 5 for splitability. In terms of stitch definition, it's not great stitch definition. It is a super bulky yarn, and it does have a little bit of a halo to it, which actually I think is quite nice for this type of yarn. But if you look here, there's some kind of rough bits of the yarn. It's not particularly clean or tidy finished to the swatch, and I really do suspect that this will felt over time and end up looking quite messy. So in terms of value for money, it is the most expensive yarn that you can get at Kmart. It is $6 Australian a ball, and you only get 31 meters in that ball. So it actually works out fairly expensive, certainly compared to the other Kmart yarns. But just as a point of comparison, for example, Oz Yarn sell the super bulky acrylic yarn for $3.50 a ball, and you get 65 meters in that ball, which is about twice as much as you get in this one. So it's half the price, twice the meterage. I haven't tried this yarn, so I'm not sure what the quality is like, but certainly it suggests that this yarn is not actually very cost effective or good value for money. So in terms of affordability or value for money, I will give this yarn 1 yarn ball out of 5. So in terms of my overall impression of this yarn, I do actually quite like the feel and the look of this yarn, but it was really just way too hard to work with and not that cost effective. So overall, I give this yarn 1 yarn ball out of 5. Do not recommend. So the next yarn I'll review is this 8-ply acrylic yarn. So it's 100 grams, approximately 270 meters in a ball. It's an 8-ply, which in US terms is a DK weight yarn. As for colour selection, there are more colour options in this yarn than any of the other anko yarns that Kmart and Target stock. So there are 8 solid colourways, and those cost $2.50 Australian a ball. And they also have 4 of these mixed colours. Those cost $3 a ball, and this colourway here is called Nectar. So in terms of softness, it's not quite as soft as the yarn cake, and certainly not as soft as the super chunky. It doesn't feel horrible. It doesn't feel overly plasticky. It is a little bit soft and squishy, but it's certainly not the softest acrylic that I've used. So I will give it a 2 yarn balls out of 5 for softness. In terms of springiness, yeah, again, it's a very stiff yarn. So I'm not expecting it to be the easiest to work with, but let's keep an open mind. It's not separating too easily, actually. It's taking a little bit for me to untwist the individual yarn strands, so I'm hopeful that means it will not be too frustrating to work with from a splitting perspective, but let's make up a swatch. So given this is an 8-ply or a DK weight yarn, I will be using my 4mm crochet and more hook. Again, the label doesn't suggest a crochet hook size, but this is what I would usually use for a 8-ply yarn. Quite interested to see how the colour changes work on this yarn. I'm sure you can hear that squeaking, but it's sort of squeaking along my hook. A tiny bit of splitting, not too bad though. Certainly not as bad as the super chunky. So here's my final swatch of half double crochets. In terms of splittability, it did split a couple of times. You might be able to see I've missed one of the strands here. So not great for splittability. I will give it a 2 yarn balls out of 5 for splittability. In terms of stitch definition, I think it's actually got quite nice stitch definition, stitches up quite lovely. I really like this colour combination as well. It's quite fast colour changes, which I think would give a really nice kind of final look to any thing that you were making with this yarn. In terms of stitch definition, though, I'll probably give it a 3 out of 5. It's fairly good stitch definition, but not the best that I've seen. So in terms of value for money, it's certainly a very affordable yarn. This cost me $3 a ball, and their solid colours are $2.50 Australian. And you get a decent amount of meterage out of one ball as well. So I think you really struggle to find acrylic yarn much or any cheaper than that, really. So I think in terms of affordability, I'll give it 4 yarn balls out of 5. So just to come back to springiness as well, it was quite good to work with. It wasn't overly stiff, although the final swatch doesn't have great drape to it. So I think I'll give it a 3 out of 5 yarn balls for springiness. So my overall impression of this yarn is I think it's actually a pretty decent low-cost yarn option. It's not the nicest feeling yarn to work with, so I think if that's really important to you, I'd probably avoid this yarn. But for the cost, it works out quite nicely. So overall, I'll give it a rating of 3 yarn balls out of 5. Okay, so as a final comparison of the 3 yarns that I've reviewed in this video, this is the super bulky, this is the yarn cake, and this was the 8-ply. In terms of my overall view on these yarns, I probably wouldn't buy the super bulky or the yarn cake. The yarn cake actually stitched up nicer than I was expecting, but it didn't feel great to crochet with, and I think there are lots of really great options for yarn cakes that feel a lot softer and are just as inexpensive. The super bulky I also wouldn't use again. I know the super chunky look is quite in at the moment, and I do actually quite like the feel and look of this yarn, but it was just so frustrating to work with, and I think the final product is a little bit messy as well. So again, I think there are definitely better options out there for super bulky weight yarns. I would potentially consider using this 8-ply again. Again, it didn't feel great. It was quite squeaky and isn't the softest of yarns, but I suspect it would probably be quite hard wearing. I do really like this color combination, and it is very affordable at $3 a ball. So this is a yarn that I would consider using if you are looking for a inexpensive yarn. Potentially you're wanting to dip your toe in the waters of crochet and don't want to shell out for anything too expensive, then I think that this 8-ply could be a really good option. So that's all I have for this yarn review. I hope you found this video useful. If you liked the video, make sure to click the like button and to subscribe to make sure you don't miss any more content. Also, if there are any other yarns that you would like me to review, particularly any New Zealand or Australian yarns, please comment in the comments on what you'd like to see me do next. Thanks so much.